Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Noontime U series at Penn State Great Valley and Penn State the Navy Yard. My name is Ed Weckerly. I'm the Director of Professional Programs at both campuses, and we invite you to now this being the third in our series of Noontime U webinars of relevant topics and things that we hope that you can actually take away and apply to the workplace. With us today is Dr. Mark Hanlon. And interesting enough, Mark and I go back a ways where Mark was my professor at the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine during my master's program, where I earned my master's in organizational development and leadership. And when I was tasked with putting together our leadership development program, our non-credit certificate at Penn State Great Valley, he was the first one I reached out to, knowing what he had done for me in my class. Here we are 8 years later, and Mark is now and has our lead instructor throughout our program, and our enrollments through that program have been stellar. So we invited Mark in here to come in and tell you a little bit more about ethically beating your competition in a crisis. So I just wanted to let everyone know we are recording this session for your, so you can observe afterwards or share. And we will be posting these on our Noontime U web series web page. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hanlon. It's all you.
So thanks, Ed, and thank you not only for this, but also for the great learnings I've had from you, and hopefully vice versa over the years. So again, everybody, thank you. Thanks for coming in. Welcome, and we're going to spend the next while just talking about ethically beating your competition in a crisis. As you'll see, that's both probably a bit easier than you might think, maybe a little different. But we also want to give you a flavor of what it's like at Penn State talking about these kinds of things as well. So first and foremost, we're talking about a topic, and we're doing this in a time. This is May of 2020. The coronavirus is changing the world as we know it. It is not only a time of health crisis, it is a time of business crisis, it is a time of working crisis, and it also is turning out to be a time of crisis of ethics. Before we get into that and how to ethically beat competition in a crisis, I really want to mention a couple of things that to me are very important. And that's in the bottom of this slide, which is remembering those who have been impacted by this crisis. Clearly, we're coming up now on more than 80,000 people who have died and suffered as they died. We've got the families and friends of those people, their loved ones who have suffered. We've got the first responders, the healthcare workers of both on the front and the people who are backfilling them as well. We've got people who are particularly susceptible, immunocompromised and susceptible to the coronavirus, who take extraordinary precautions, not just self-quarantining, but really changing their lifestyle. And of course, those whose daily lives, responsibilities, income are more directly impacted, and those who are indirectly impacted. There's not a whole lot of people on Earth who are not impacted in some way or another. And I just want to take a moment and remember those folks in the context of what we're going to be talking about. A side note, you see this at the bottom. Officially, the virus is severe acute respiratory syndrome, novel coronavirus 2, and the disease that comes from that virus is COVID-19 or C19. For the most part, I'll be calling this COVID-19, but it refers to both the virus and the disease. So remembering those who are impacted. As Ed mentioned, I've been teaching graduate school as an adjunct since 2002, coming up on 20 years. I have been working with Ed at the Penn State Great Valley and the Navy Yard since 2013, but a little bit in terms of my background, and I just tried to put it in some quick bullet points. I've been supporting group transformations for more than 35 years, from the 82,000 people in the Navy to thousands of people at Exelon in the field, to creating self-managed factories, managerless, supervisorless factories at General Electric, that is now Lockheed. I've worked with more than 255 high-performing organizations, achieving 55 to 85% improvements in productivity. We've had more than $400 million in improvements. Some of those are operational, so they repeat every year. I personally have some patents in change, recognized by the US Navy. I have a master black belt. I actually designed part of the International Space Station a while ago. So part of this is, on the one hand, I really have a strong passion and background in terms of transformation and what does that look like. I also have a business background. I have 23 years of profit loss responsibility. I've managed 9-figure budgets, held executive positions in manufacturing, services, consulting, but I also have an academic background. My doctorate is in organizational development and change. We're certainly going through change now. I have a master's in human organizational systems and a bachelor's in physics and astronomy. I have taught and continue to teach credit and non-credit, master's, doctoral courses. I've authored a textbook on change, some other books. My latest book, Creating Effortless Change, has just been released. And I love being with family, friends. I love astronomy and nature. And I've flown aerobatics with planes upside down deliberately. So I have a diverse background, and what I try to do in talking about things like competition, things like ethics, things like crises, I try to bring this diverse background to bear to talk about it. So let's start at the end. I don't believe in mystery. Let's start at the end. In times of crisis, this is about being essential. People will remember how you treat them today. And that how becomes an important part, not just what you do for them, but how you do that for them. I'm going to go into more detail on these, but be remembered. That's actually incredibly easier than you might think. Be humble, patient, understanding. It is a time of crisis for all of us. Be trusted. Being ethical is a big way of being trusted. Be valued. How are you helping your customer of all and your employees of all sides, of all ways? Be unique. Again, that's actually, you're already doing this. Just be conscious and aware of it. Being valued, being unique means being essential. And that is the theme of today's webinar. So let's take a step back for a second, because we're using the word crisis and kind of throwing it here and throwing it there. But what does it really mean in terms of people's daily lives? Well, first of all, we talk about the coronavirus. We talk about a pandemic, and that is a big, big deal. But there's really a lot more than just the pandemic. Clearly, there's that. It keeps changing a bit. Until everyone's tested, we won't know, but at least 15% of the people in the United States may be infected. Unemployment. In the jobs report for April, 27 million workers had applied for first-time unemployment. That number is almost 10 million more now. The things that are essential in inventory are at record lows. Just going to where the stores are available and seeing shelves and shelves and racks of things that aren't there emphasizes the things we don't have. And clearly that's not just medical, it's also in cleaning supplies, paper products, and other things. By the same time, some of the things that are not essential are at record levels of unused. They're high record levels. Oil, refined gasoline are running out of places to put it because they have so much to do, so much available. NGOs, non-government agencies, other structural supports are not equipped to handle. We have safety nets that are designed for a few people. Globally, we generally don't have safety nets designed for everybody in the world. So, and what is beginning to come out, New York started talking about this, is as a result of being put together, as a result of all this stress and everything else, severe and significant mental health issues are happening. So my point is simply, when we're talking about crisis, it's not a crisis, it's a crisis that we are all in, and we're all sharing that. So if we take a look at some of what the media has been saying, whether it's Gallup doing surveys, big business under the gun and under scrutiny in terms of, okay, now what? People are actually, everybody's making suggestions on how to talk about the virus, including talk about the virus by not talking about the virus. We'll talk about that in a moment. The tech decisions, how we, whether it's something like this, which is Zoom, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's other things, have enormous impact. People are getting into heat under scrutiny because they've taken money that, whether they need or they don't need, actually has created a bit of stress for the folks. And with the backlash, they've returned. I saw a number a few days ago that said of $1.5 billion be given to public companies. That just means anybody can buy their stock. Public companies, more than $500 million has been returned by those companies, simply, as you should see here with AutoNation, more than $500 million because of the backlash, because it is perceived as being unethical for them to take the money if in fact they didn't need it. So let's talk ethical by talking about what isn't ethical. So on the top row here, we know that in the US that there are a number of things that are so unethical as to be illegal. If you do them, you will have fines, you could go to jail. It is against the law, it's a crime. And clearly that means fraudulent promises, contracts, intent to do harm. The FBI, the Securities Exchange Commission, and other states' attorneys general have been looking at that. They've been intercepting shipments of fraudulent shipments of people with medical supplies to first responders and other people. And those are clearly illegal. But there's another layer, if you will, that is unethical. What about hoarding and price gouging? What about increasing the cost? If you're a retailer and you're low on stock, do you increase the price for stuff that's remaining for a distributor? And again, you may not have all of the material that you need to give. Do you give that? Do you selectively give it to your best customers, and hang on to them and tell the others no? Or do you increase the price? Do you fundamentally treat different people differently under the same circumstances? And clearly, do you make false or misleading claims about yourself? Yep, we can do that. Yeah, I've got that right here on the shelf. Just come on over. When in fact, you might not. So are those ethical and unethical? Looking at ethics, and this webinar is not about to tell anybody, I'm certainly not going to tell any of you what your ethics are. Ethics are more than how we behave, it's also how we're perceived. And as you can see, the quote here is from the dictionary, is ethics are a set of principles with right conduct. Okay, what does principles mean? What does right conduct mean? And all of that is really about not trying for each of us to figure out how to match our ethics with anybody else, because we have ethics too, right? You've got yours, I've got mine, somebody else may have theirs. I'm certain they do. And that doesn't mean that we're all the same. In fact, it's going to be really hard to be the same. But what we can do is be true to ourselves, and we can focus on what it feels like from the other person. And that gets to the right hand of this slide. So how do they feel ethically treated? Is it fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me? In other words, okay, you got me, but I won't trust you again. Usually ethical treatment feels fair. It feels fair by the other people. It feels like you've been treating them fairly. They've been getting fair treatment, fair dignity, fair access, fair pricing, fair pay. Remember, we're talking not only here about customers, but also about employees. they feel understood, they feel cared about. Fundamentally at the bottom, they feel like their conditions and perspectives have been taken into consideration. That really turns out to be important. So, the lasting impact of ethics. You may remember a few years ago, well, first of all, the Ford family, as in the US car manufacturer, and the Firestone family, as in tires, were literally 100-year-old best friends. Even after 100 years, they would take vacations together. The families, the descendants would come together. But then when the tires started blowing out and Firestone tried to like, in the words of the press, in the words ultimately of Firestone and certainly of Ford, there was some dancing going on, and that they were not telling the truth. And to this day, Ford doesn't use Firestone. In fact, the impact on Firestone was so bad that they had to declare bankruptcy, and the Japanese firm Bridgestone came in and took them over because of trust. What happened in ethics is they lost trust. But the reverse can happen too. This is a few years ago, but the airlines don't own their own planes. They lease them because they're just so incredibly expensive. There's a few exceptions. This is one of those exceptions. The workers felt so empowered, felt so appreciated by Delta, they took their money and they bought their company a jet. The Delta workers bought a jet for Delta. More famously, just an example of how much trust there is in trapeze artists. Because, okay, now you got to let go, and I completely trust you to grab me. Trust matters. Trust is at the heart of ethics. Perhaps the most famous example is that of Tylenol. Despite Johnson & Johnson's challenges and how they're dealing with it today, back in 1982 in Chicago, there was a case where somebody, I don't believe they ever caught the person, was injecting poison into Tylenol capsule, into the pill containers of Tylenol. And Tylenol, at a very high cost to themselves, made a big deal and took all the Tylenol off all the shelves, not just in Chicago or the US, but everywhere globally. And then they developed wrapping and how to do all those things that we have today in terms of how to open that thing, are because of the way, how to open the pill box, how to open the other pieces, and not just child safety. They're really to show that it was sanitized all the way from the factory. The so what to that is they did the right thing, but they were able to also turn the right thing into trust. For decades, the brand name, a brand you can trust, all goes back to 1982, even though even these in the 20 teens, they're still doing the same advertising. And if you compare the Tylenol acetaminophen with generic acetaminophen, the price is much higher for Tylenol. Well, they may do some other things in marketing, packaging, and so forth, but chemically, it's the same thing. And yet they can make a premium and they can make profit because of trust, because of ethics. GE was able to do a similar thing in terms of the best example of manager and labor relations, but this really happens around the world in terms of doing things. I just want to say a quick personal story. So I, like everybody else, had my $1,200 check, and I had it with me, and I happened to be going, and we were doing takeout in Philadelphia, and I took out my credit card to pay, went back, didn't think anything of it, except I got a LinkedIn message the next day from Sarconi's Bakery, which had been next door. Okay, don't know what that's about. Hey, Mark, we found your check endorsed on the sidewalk. Apparently, when I pulled out my credit card, it had flipped out and fell on the ground. And we've got it here. Call me personally, do this. Hey, I'll go direct. Here's my direct cell phone number. We want to make sure you get your money that is yours. And we didn't want anyone else to get it. Now it was endorsed. They could have easily cashed it. They didn't. And they made a point of just talking to me one-on-one, established, and knowing full well, we both knew full well they could have done something else. I will remember Sarconi's Bakery. I am now going to try and do what I can to patronize them, to tell other people about it. I've certainly mentioned them here in this webinar because they did the ethical thing in a crisis. They did the right thing for the right reasons in a very, very tough time. It is about helping each other. It is about making a difference. So, quick timeout for questions so far. And Ed, I think you're on mute.
Yes, we have some questions, Mark. Sorry about that. Actually, what we did is we opened up the floor for some folks to ask some questions. So we have a couple. So I'm going to list one to you. What do you do when your ethics don't match the ethics of your customers?
That's a great question. As I mentioned before, I'm not here to tell anybody what their ethics are. I'm pretty clear on my ethics. And then what happens when my ethics are different than yours? Okay, that might be one. What happens when they collide? And for me, part of the answer to that, and what has worked for a lot of companies, and this could be simple, I say simple, it could be simply at the retail level. It could be a distributor trying to deal with this nationally. It can be manufacturers dealing with, cross-lingual, cross-cultural. We've got all the different ways in which ethics can be different. Step number one is to be clear on your own ethics. Step number two is to understand the other person, is to understand how the ethics of the other person are being impacted, and find ways that if they happen to collide, then a question becomes, okay, where can we meet? What are the areas in which we can be supporting each other? And I want to emphasize, this is not about forgetting you and your ethics, but it is focused on understanding your customers' ethics, your employees' ethics. Be understanding. I did not reach out to Sarconi's Bakery because I had no idea, saying, hey, did you find it? They reached out to me, and they wanted to find out from me what my situation was and to do with it. And that's the first step here. Reach out, make the connection, and then be understanding. You don't have to compromise yourself in that, but together you can find ways in which those ethics work. And I think you'll find that as simply practicing ethics and being true makes a big difference in trust, and ultimately a big difference in your client retention.
Okay, thanks, Mark. We have another question. How do you handle a competitor who is promising the world and has no intention to deliver, yet they get business and I don't?
That last part makes it tough. It's easy to say, hey, I'm going to take the high road and everything's going to be great and they'll believe me, except for that last piece. I have had, the old saying, right, is that when people, and you look and people trust you, and then somebody opens their mouth and away goes the trust. Ultimately, that happens with somebody who's not being ethical, who is making false promises. I have actually lost, when I was in field sales, I lost some significant business. It was a very large customer to a competitor, and I never mentioned that person's name, and I certainly am not now, to a competitor that was using illegal methods, highly unethical and illegal methods to get the business. And the quick answer in the short run is that person got the business and I was out. What I made sure, and I didn't get the order, and I didn't get the next order or the next order, but I made sure that I connected with my client or my previous client, and I made sure that hey, so how's that working out? I'm not bad mouthing my competition. I'm not saying it's arrogant. All I'm doing is asking a question of, how's that working out for you? And it started getting a little iffy because the other person made promises they couldn't keep. And that was the least of the problems. But I was there. In one case, I showed up in the middle of winter in a snowstorm. They were open. And I said, how's that going? The client and customer knew that I cared about them, that I wanted to do it, and that I was always going to be there. So inevitably, when the unethical and the illegal things fell apart, in this case, it only took 6 months, I was there and I got a much greater order. And by the way, price was much less of a factor. So I got to put more profit margin in. I was still competitive with others, but I didn't have to meet the cutthroat price of that other person. And we all they ended up better with a solid relationship and delivery. I ended up with a more committed customer and also a longer term contract.
Okay, thanks, Mark. To stay on task and on time for this webinar, we're going to move into the next segment, and then we'll throw some questions out in between those.
Great. Thank you. Good questions. I want to go back, having talked about ethics and the crisis, I want to talk for just a second about the basic value imperative. This is something came up with back in the 90s, and it was basically, why are you in business? Or more appropriately, how are you in business? And what is a great conversation if we get a chance to have real-time conversation beyond the webinar at some point, this is a great one to have. I'm going to suggest to you that any organization, I started out talking about back in the 90s about this was a basic business imperative, but it turns out it's also true with government. It's also true with non-government organizations. It's true with nonprofits. It's true with community organizations, that fundamentally you have to provide a unique perceived value added service or product, or you simply won't survive. And the dialogue is talking about examples of that. But being unique or different doesn't mean that you have to be massively different. It just means that you are different from your competition. Now, in the case of manufacturing, that may be a product, your form, fit, or function. In the case of being a distributor, it may be in terms of, are you carrying inventory? Are you arranging? Are you being an effective interface to get the product from the suppliers to your clients? In the case of retail, what's that look like in terms of, are you providing it? Is it on the shelf, or can they get it? If you're offering offline, is it convenient? It's the how that might be different, but you are different. You are different than your competition. You're perceived, you're actually seen. So with apologies to Kevin Costner and James Earl Jones, if you build it, they won't come if they don't know about it. And so part of this is being perceived, not only in terms of, hey, are you recognized for your service, and do they understand but just even that you're there. In a lot of cases, and especially now, where folks are not walking down the street to retail, they're not doing the other pieces, manufacturing is not in, and now basically all we see is a version of a camera and a background. How are people seeing you, and are they seeing you in terms of your branding, your naming? Do they recognize you? What do they associate you with? Value added. Fundamentally, you have to add value to what you're doing. Yes, you have to be different. Yes, they have to know about you and know that you're there. But they also have to get a benefit from doing stuff. I had a discussion a few days ago with my partner, and we were talking about the fact that New York, the city of New York, has been adding, up until this crisis, but they've been adding autonomous electric vehicles and giving them the taxi medallions, right? So so that you would get in and you would either pre-program or say it and say your destination, and the autonomous electric car would simply take you to your destination. And we were talking, and she was commenting about, yeah, but I want a person there. So that got back to, what about yellow cab? What is different about yellow cab that Uber and then Lyft began to take over? And then it was, okay, with Uber, there have been issues in terms of treating of the drivers and employees. And then Lyft was beginning to come in to be different. And then, so you've got all these different things. It's not just about what kind of car you get into, or what color it is, or how it's going. It's all of these things together that really result in why somebody would do business with you. And ultimately, if they don't do business with you, you're probably not going to survive. So that's true regardless. That's true all the time. And by the way, that's independent of size. I've had this discussion with companies that are in the billions of dollars, and I've had this discussion with companies that have 1 and 2 people. It really is very, very similar. All right, but what's different now? And I kind of began to allude to it. So what are you doing differently? Are you being on Zoom like everybody else and like we're doing here? How are you being different from your competition during this crisis? How are you being seen? I mentioned that perceived is also about logo. It's really branding. What are they associating with when they're talking to you? One of the things about being in a retail shop is just being in the shop has a certain experience, right? Just being in the shop, the aisles are over there. I've got, the brand names here. The front looks like this. I don't have that here. I don't have that with the camera. What do I do? So it is about letting folks know and reminding folks about your appearance now. How will you provide them value added? What is it? And I'm going to suggest that this is about connecting on a regular basis. It means calling people, either having, on the phone, texting, whether you use, whatever kind of social media. But this is about connecting with people and understanding where they're coming from right now. And one of the advantages of the C-19 pandemic is that now we get the chance to do things. We don't have to go to their home, obviously. In addition to the potentially creep factor, that might also just not be healthy. So what do? You can use this technology to make the connections that you wouldn't do otherwise. I didn't think about Tony Baker. That was a retail that was no touch. And I'm going to remember them because of how they did in the crisis. So, keys to the diet, keeping it healthy. If you're safe, if you're not healthy throughout the crisis, then your family will be impacted, friends will be impacted. You won't be able to provide other things that won't matter. The second one is really significant. A whole bunch of webinars by itself. Find ways to fund your current operations. Having been in some of these cases, this is not about whether you're making profit. It's not about whether you're making money. This is about whether this is about whether or not your cash. And if you have not done a statement, a capital statement, or have connected, I encourage you to work online and find an online to it. To your to do it, talk to the other people in the company, find out where your cash position is. For all for your, because it is about remaining cash positive, and you may have to do things. You may have to try to collect bills sooner. You may have to pay bills later. You may have to find whether SBA, whether the other pieces, find ways to fund yourself. Keeping key employees available. This is just like keeping key customers available. Keeping them online, keeping contact. What happens when, as we ramp up now, not if, but when, and now all of a sudden it happens, do you have the people, your key employees in place to be able to meet that demand? How are you going to do it? How do you keep them available? Keeping ethical, trusting relationships all the way through. Being remembered. This is an opportunity to be remembered for the ways in which you connect and do that. Stay agile, stay flexible, stay ready to move, because even within a state, it may be different. Here across the street, literally, it may be different. How are you going to do all this and provide unique perceived value added? Okay, let me just talk quickly about a couple of new skills. Adam, in our previous webinar, in terms of project management, touched on a couple of things, but I want to talk a little bit more about whether we're going to use Zoom as an example. It could be Cisco, it can be Skype, Duo, FaceTime, all kinds of things, right? And they're all great. Anybody, or almost anybody, can join in at almost any time. We stay in partial contact, right? You see the kind of sort of joking, and I had that long before this crisis, where it's just computer monitors to each other, like, well, now that I know you're all here. A couple of things to remember. First of all, in a very weird way. I'm going to talk about two ways. One way is in which nothing is captured, and a way in which everything is captured. That paradox drives a big part of your effectiveness in video conferencing. Remembering that the camera catches everything. All background is visible, right? So do a practice run. If you have to move this way, what else is in the way? If you have to move that way, what else is in the way? What does it look like? Pick one place to originate videos. Arrange the room. I would suggest not making it look absolutely perfect, but make it look real. Use it to your best advantage. Dress as you would. So if we were doing this webinar and it was partial webinar and people, and I hadn't met you before, I would be wearing a suit and a tie for the first time. So I'm going to wear it now. I would strongly urge you to not wear part of it, but do all of it just as you would normally. In other words, I'm not wearing jeans along with my jacket. I'm not depending on you only seeing part of me. There's two reasons for that. One is if you have to reach or get up and go somewhere, they're going to find out. The second is how you feel. Put yourself in the same position that you would be. That's really important because that comes through. I'm going to mention one other piece, and we normally, if I'm sitting here like this, talking to you right now, we don't normally talk this way. And even when I'm sitting like this is a distance that we don't normally do. If in fact we were having a meeting and I would be back here, maybe even further back, and we would be talking. But normally in Zoom, it's a much more intimate environment in terms of the camera. There's another way, however, we almost have a complete course on this at Great Valley, and that is in virtual connection, there's a lot missing. Yes, you're seeing my body language. I'm actually exaggerating my body language a bit because you may not be able to see all of my face. There's also unconscious cues that we use, and there's a number of psychology reasons for this and organizational development and behavior pieces. But bottom line is, every time we're virtual, we're only giving a percentage, like 30 to 40%, of the indication that we would normally do in person. Once in a while, that's fine. On an ongoing basis, there are things that are missing. This actually gets back to trust. So remember boundaries. Remember that everything is getting recorded. Sometimes I wish wait a minute. I want to go back. We can't. It's done. Use what I call the Drudge or newspaper test, where if it shows up in Drudge, are you still okay with it? Distractions are going to happen. Dogs, kids, whatever. When it happens, just laugh them off, deal with it, keep going. Trust is really key. Active listening means that I am going to show you that I heard what you said. I'm going to rephrase what you said on all your key stuff. I'm going to work on being authentic in my body language. Be sensitive to that. Use inflection, emphasis where you might not otherwise, simply because the video is cutting it back. One quick thing. A lot of people, particularly in Zoom, use the virtual background, but you can see them anytime they lean back, then they tend to lose an arm or a head. It does not help trust if people think that you're hiding something. You might be hiding that you didn't clean the room or whatever, but I always recommend that people not use the virtual background simply because it gets in the way of trust. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I would encourage you to read the books that we have. You want to be authentic, want to stay in personal contact. I mentioned that. Demonstrate what you can do. Don't promise what you can't. Building trust is a combination of head language, logic, heart language, passion, soul language, which is about connection. And your reputation is based on being trustworthy. And your reputation is subtracted by the more you focus on yourself. It is enhanced and multiplied by the more you focus on somebody else. For more reading on those, I put the references at the bottom. Okay, another big section. Questions so far?
Yes. Okay, Mark. So we have a few other questions, and one is, these are good ideas for completely closed environment where everyone is at home. What suggestions do you have for the recovery process as some people open up and while others are still on lockdown?
That's a very good question and a tough one to answer, because the answer is it depends. Right now, we've got some folks who are opening up. Right now, I happen to be in a county in Pennsylvania that is mostly locked down. And if I drive a few miles, not a lot, in that direction, I'm in a county that's not in the same level of lockdown. In some cases, those are even across the street. So part of this is continue to reach out to people who are locked in. I know who your biggest customers are, your biggest clients are, know who your key employees are. Make sure that you're continuing this kind of connection. And again, it doesn't have to be Zoom. It could be text. It could be a phone call, whatever. Make the connection and understand where they're coming from, and then support them. As you open up, make sure that people see you. So for example, let's say that you happen to own a retail operation that is not allowed to open yet. Let's say, and salons are carefully opening up these days, but you're right next to a restaurant where people have takeout and everything. Make sure that you look like you're going to be open. Whether that's sitting outside, you can do Zooms from curbside. Whether that is literally keeping the lights on so that people know that you haven't gone out of business during that time. Unfortunately, some people have. As a manufacturer, keep the things going. As you begin to ramp up, let others know what your master production schedule looks like. Let them know when their delivery is actually going to happen. As a distributor, let your folks know, contact them. And some folks you're going to be able to contact in person to go make that delivery. Use that example, obviously with appropriate protection and sanitation and so forth. So as we open up, we can begin to open up all the way. Don't forget the people, your customers, employees who are still on lockdown. There is a way of doing all of that at the same time.
Okay, thanks, Mark. How about this one? These are things we try to do during the best of times. How can we do these things during tough times when money, people, and time are at a premium?
Great question. And the simple answer is sometimes you can't. I would say the conventional things, advertising is a great example, where a lot of people would spend money on advertising. Now, retail is going to be, advertising is going to be different than a distributorship, than a service organization, than manufacturing and so forth. But however you generally did advertising before, first of all, it may not be targeting the right people. So you may not even want to do that. Second of all, you may have to find more creative ways. One of the creative ways is to begin to partner with people. Partner with people you might not have thought of before. There's something actually called co-opetition, where you cooperate with who would otherwise be your competition. And in that case, you take cases where together you might do branding together. Now that's where, because you're different, unique, and perceive value added, you're not going to be in direct competition. But in other cases, you might have slightly. Now you can partner. Now you can partner in terms of that branding, in terms of the advertising, in terms of doing the other things. Remember that money, although it's important, is not everything. That's why this is about being essential, and it's about trust. And how you build trust is going to be very important. That doesn't take money. It takes contact. It takes connection. It takes your motivation and your intention. That's particularly true with employees, where now it's not, you may not be able to pay them, and some people might be able to be paid and others not. Know that you care. Let them know that you care. You understand where they're coming from and so forth. So it is about using some of these different tools we've talked about in order to build trust, to be essential. And those tools don't have to take money.
Okay, Mark, do you want to just move on to the third and
Yeah.
final? Okay.
Yeah, and actually this segment is shorter than the others because it kind of brings it all together. So thanks, Ed. So ethically beating your competition in a crisis. Understanding, and I'm really bringing pieces together here. Understanding, again, what your unique perceived value added is, what's different, what can be seen, how are you helping? Again, not just your customers, but your employees. If you understand your customers' unique perceived value added, remember I said everybody's got this, right? Everybody. If they don't do it, they're basically going to be out of business. So if you understand your customers' unique perceived value added, you have an opportunity to be part of their key chain. What does it feel like to be ethically treated from your customers and your employees? If you don't know, and it's even if you think you do know, it's a good idea to just ask them, how do you feel? How do you feel from the way I treat you? How do you feel the way that our company does? What can we do better? Hey, there are some things I can't do right now, but I really want to take this kind of breathing time, and it may be anything but breathing if you're just trying to do everything with no money. But use that as a breathing time to connect with your employees, connect with your customers, and find out more. There are people who try to buy a good reputation. There are people who try to legally bury a bad reputation. I've never seen a good, effective means of that. The best way to buy a good reputation is to get a good reputation with trust. The best way to bury a bad reputation is to rebuild it with a good one. Kyle gave a webinar a couple of times ago, and he's very famous for saying, people will remember how they felt about dealing with you longer than they will remember what you did. So what people remember feeling lasts much longer. There's actually in our brain some recent functional MRIs show that we associate memory with the feeling at the time. Literally, memory lasts longer with more intense feeling. So the negative feeling, go for the positive ones. In this case, I show this at the bottom. Ethically beating somebody doesn't mean beating them. It doesn't. You play their game, they're going to win, right? Don't play their game. Play your game and rise above your competition. Force them to play your game. It may not always feel the traditional way, but it is incredibly powerful. So, rising above your competition means that your products and services are essential. If you have no competition, if you have a trusting relationship, this is a great opportunity to increase, enhance, or start one trusting relationship. And much time taking place and getting your competition during rising above your competition because of the crisis is essential. So if you have a real competition, and it's difficult for someone else to take your place, you now above your competition. I started to mention one piece before about your customers' unique perceived value added. You have one, they have one. When you become an enabler for them to provide it to their customer, then also you become an essential part of their supply chain. You become essential in a way that now you don't have any competition. So find out what your customers and your employees unique perceived value added are. Find a way to be essential in there, and now you're bridging even greater connection together. So, in sum, I started off saying, be remembered, be in regular contact. Don't afraid to use branding. I've tried to quietly put different books up there in terms of branding without calling attention to it, as I just did now. You don't need to call attention to your branding or your logo. They need to have an experience. Be humble, be patient. Because of the crisis impact on them, they may have to take time getting to the real dialogue. Use active listening to find out. Be understanding. All of this is being essential by how you interact with your customers and your employees. Be trusted, be ethical, trust of character, communication, be trustworthy, develop that reputation. It is not only how you do it, it's also what you do. What have you committed to? What are you providing? What is your service? Be valued, not just your unique perceived value added, but how do you build into and enable your customers' own unique perceived value added? And how will you be different during this crisis? How is the crisis itself going to think? Everybody is thinking is more intense. The emotions and passions are higher. What you do now will be remembered for a much longer time. So be essential by how you interact, be essential by what you do. Being valued, being unique is all about being essential. So be essential. We're going to go back to the beginning. Your customers will remember how you treat them. Be humble, be understanding, be trusted, be valued, be unique, and above all, be essential. So, questions?
Okay, Mark. Well, we have just one or two more.
Okay.
And there's one question was asked, I need money to just stay in business. How do I do that?
There was an old, a bad joke that was told by a stand-up comedian. It might have been Steve Martin when he was doing stand-up. But it was, to get $1 million, it's very easy. First of all, you get $1 million, and then you invest it very carefully. And he does everything to ignore the fact that you still needed the $1 million. Here I go back to the cash. And that is, a lot of things are based on money. So if I'm a distributor and I'm buying something, I typically look at my gross margin. Am I going to sell it at this price, but they gave me this price and so forth. They might give me a rebate later on, which is how you can buy cars at invoice and the dealer still makes money. You do all that, but that's money, that's not cash. So talk to your suppliers and find a different way to get cash. In other words, is there a way, because they're in a hard time too and they also want to get it, is there a way in which that you can actually get the money before you have to pay your supplier? I'm not suggesting that you do that underhandedly, just the opposite. But this is about, again, partnering with suppliers to make that happen. They have different funding sources than you might have. You might have it differently. It might be a bank, it might be SBA, but it might also be your vendors as well. Find ways, if it's buying on consignment in case of retail and then selling, about different amounts of things. Focus on cash. There's a quote down at the lower left here, and it says, when your outgo exceeds your income, your upkeep becomes your downfall. Find things that don't have to take a lot of ongoing expense independent of your sales. Focus on cash. Don't forget to do the important stuff as well. I'm only suggesting that under normal times, cash is often looked less at than money. In these times, cash has to take precedence over money.
Hey, Mark. Well, I want to thank you, especially for taking time out of your busy schedule to run us through our Noontime U series. This has been a great segment on, ethically, beating your competition. I also want to make sure that folks are looking at future Noontime U series. We have a number of them coming up, very relevant, especially with what's going on. And one other piece to mention that, Dr. Hanlon, he speaks or he teaches in our programs that go, through many different segments. We have leadership, we have Lean Six Sigma. We also have other programs like project management, supply chain, our graduate programs that that encompass our MBA, even our engineering programs like engineering management. These are things that we talk about. These are, topics that are relevant across the board in any program you're looking for. So if you need any advice, you're looking for something to add to your resume, please feel free to reach out to Penn State Great Valley or Penn State at the Navy Yard. So without further ado, I'm going to take this time to thank you again for joining us, and we hope you join us for the next one.
Thank you, folks. Take care.